Hello and welcome to Illuminating Primary Care, brought to you by Menlo Recruitment. I'm your host today, James Trustwell, and I'm joined by Dr. Hasnain Abbasi, one of the founding clinical directors of AT Medics. Welcome, Hasnain.
Hi, James. Thank you.
So established in 2004 by 6 clinical directors, AT Medics run 46 surgeries and 3 walk-in centres, serving 370,000 patients across London. They merged with Operose Health in February 2021, and between the two, they now run a combined 66 sites, serving 600,000 patients, making them the biggest primary care provider in the UK. AT Medics has consistently turned around previously troubled or failing practices with poor CQC ratings, turning them into slicker, fully functioning practices and dragging them out of special measures to become CQC good or even outstanding practices. So first question, Hasnain, how did AT Medics start?
Thanks, James. So look, AT Medic started in 2004-5, in that kind of time period, and 2 of my partners, who were the year above, really, in terms of the year ahead, in terms of doing GP training. So we were all kind of doing different things. Tarek, one of the partners, he was doing pediatrics, I was doing anesthetics. And we kind of decided that we were going to work together. So we kind of swapped out of our specialty training and into general practice. But really, at the time, we had no idea that we'd end up having all these practices. Our idea was really just to work together in a single practice, which was really unrealistic because there were 6 of us. So what we did is we basically, during my GP registrar year, and Imran and Ozzy had already qualified, we just started writing to all the primary care directors in London, which seems really archaic at the time, but literally wrote a letter and posted it in an envelope. And nobody replied, except one guy. One guy replied and said, "Why don't you come and meet us?" So the 4 of us went up there and met the guy. This was Kensington and Chelsea PCT at the time. And he said, "We've got a tiny practice. It's run out of 1 room, and the GP's just been struck off. We need someone to run it from Monday. Would you be happy to do it?" And Ozzy and Imran said, "Yeah, we'll do it. We'll take it on."
Yeah.
And so that was kind of our first. And in parallel to that, there was another tiny practice in Mottingham, which is down in southeast London, a very deprived area, where I think the GP had a stroke, unfortunately. And Ozzy had been there and had done a few locums, and just this practice was absolutely in pieces. So he approached the PCT and said, "Look, why don't you let us run it? We'll still be locums, but we want to do a bit more than a locum does. We want to try and digitize it and make it better." And really, that's the kernel of where it started. I mean that those 2 practices really kind of got us going. 2 tiny practices. And the time at which me and Tarek then qualified, there were 4 of us, and we only had a list size of about 3,000 patients. And one doctor kind of listened to us and just laughed and just said, "We'll see how far you guys get with 3,000 patients." So that kind of spurred us on a little bit. But that's kind of the kernel of where it started. Really, we wanted to work together, but it didn't ever really happen. We just ended up getting a couple of small practices.
Wow, that's really interesting and not what I expected the answer to be at all. So when you talked about you were doing different speciality training, so did you then all move to GP and do your 3-year GP training? And was it at the end of that you approached all those practices, by writing your letter? Is that the kind of the chronology of what happened?
So I don't know if you can hear, but there's thunder going on in the background here. What happened is that Imran, really, whose idea it was, this was earlier. This was probably in around 2002, 2003. At that time, Manib, one of our partners, was in the RAF. Tarek was doing pediatrics. Like I said, I was doing anesthetics. The other 2 were already within general practice, but we were just kind of throwing ideas around. How can we work together? It'd be quite fun to do it. It was only really when we all got into general practice that we said, "Okay, what are we going to do now? How are we going to make this thing happen?" And we just thought, "Okay, let's write." In those days, we had a little book. It sat on my trainer's shelf, and it had all of the PhD directors' numbers on it. And we just decided to write to them, really, in our naivety, thinking, and as always, there's always one person, luckily, who saves your bacon, really.
Yeah.
And so it was at that time that we started. So we were registrars at the time. When we then came out of training, me and Tarek, we then caught up with Imran and Ozzy, who had already been GPs for a year. And so then the four of us, and then the other two were still doing their own bits. And they joined us a year later because we were all at slightly different bits of our training, had taken
Right.
different routes. So really, for the first year, I mean, we ran those two practices. They were really tiny practices. They were really, you know, probably hadn't changed much since the 60s or 70s. No computerization, uh, poor premises. And so we did work with the PCT to look at premises, but we did a lot of quality improvement in that time. And really, it's where we learnt. You know, we learnt systems, we learnt processes, we learnt to protocolize stuff. Um, but in terms of that transition to where we got to in AT Medics, that really came probably about 7 months later. So at the time, this is 2005, 2006, 2005, the Labour government brought in the idea of APMS contracts, which
Mm,
really allowed corporate entities to hold GP contracts. Prior to that, you had to really be in a partnership, broadly speaking, to hold a
mm,
contract. And there were two types: there were GMS and PMS contracts. And really, I don't think they had us in mind when those contracts were formed. They were to allow much larger organizations like maybe Virgin Care
yeah.
or Care UK or the other larger organizations to do it. It wasn't really envisaged that it would be GPs, but it suited us at the time to set up as a limited company. Um, and so when so the first contract that came out um, really was Barbie surgery. So that first tiny contract that we had run in a temporary way, we then bid for that contract when it came out.
Mm,
Now, at the time, no one really knew much about it. So we were quite lucky. We kind of had an open goal really to shoot
mm,
into. So we bid for this practice. We basically got it because we'd been running it for 6 months anyway.
yeah.
And then 6 months later in East London, uh, I would say the first proper procurement of a contract that I can recall ever really in the NHS for primary care really came out. That was really the first proper one. And in that contract, you may not remember, you're too young, but United Health had
I
wanted
do
to enter the
remember.
market. So United Health were a large American corporation that
Yeah.
wanted, had thoughts about entering the NHS. And then there was another company called Mercury Health, which were the predecessor to Care UK. There was us. And so just a couple of us really turning up, and there were whole teams of other people there. But we really knew our stuff. So we bid for that contract and we beat all those big entities. One is it gave us a lot of confidence
Mm,
that we knew, we could write a bid
yeah.
because we'd never written a bid before. I mean, we literally Googled in how to write a bid. It sounds crazy now, but we didn't know how to write a bid. And
Yeah.
bids were very different in those days to how they are
Yeah.
now. It was like writing a GCSE project. You basically had to compile a bid with all the things you thought were important. So
Mm,
anyway, we won that. We won that, which we had no expectation of winning that, and we won that, and that really gave us confidence to really take it on.
yeah.
And then at that point, we really had two or three practices,
Yeah.
and it
So
kind of snowballed after that.
you wrote a better bid than a huge American corporation in a United Health then, who probably had bid writers, presumably.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question about bid writing because bid writing is probably one of the most depressing things you can do in your life, and it kills your time with your family. It takes hours and hours and hours to do, and
Mm,
so really over the last kind of 15 years, obviously we've
mm,
written a lot of bids,
mm,
and we have always written our own bids,
mm,
and it's the most difficult thing to do because the level of detail, the quality of the writing, particularly the clinical angles, you really can't get from someone. We did try and use a bid writer at one point,
mm.
um, but it really didn't work out, to be honest. And we never used one again. And in fact, even that bid with the bid writer, we actually rewrote it because we weren't happy with what the bid writer was writing. So we
Right.
never used the bid writer again.
Yeah.
Um, I think all good businesses have to have very good people writing bids
Yeah.
because it's the life and blood of your organization to
Yeah. It's
grow
too
it. There is no
important.
other way. Yeah,
Yeah. If it's just a bid writer that does it as a speciality, I guess they don't really know the intricacies of general practice and those types of things, and could end up
correct.
taking more time away from your family if they're asking lots of questions. Um, just going back a second, just when you're answering that first question about how ATMX started, you mentioned that you were a registrar when you wrote to all those PCTs at the time. So what were you in your ST3 year?
Yeah, so ST3, yeah, we were
Right,
ST3.
and
I
that's
know it sounds
amazing.
brilliant now.
It sounds mad now. Um,
And then we came
so
out just so we qualified. So we qualified in February. I don't know why it ended up being February. Qualified in February, and in April we were, we were running our own practice. I was running, me and Tarek were basically in our particular practice, and Ozzy and Imran were in a different one,
Yeah.
and just kind of learnt on the job.
So yeah. So how well, that was going to be my next question, was how you knew how to run those first two practices, and how you learned.
We, I mean, look, the truth is we probably didn't. I mean, now at the time we thought we knew what we were doing,
Yeah.
and it's a feature of kind of, when you qualify as a GP at that time, you think you're like the best GP there's ever been because you just passed your exams. Now, when I look back, obviously it's a completely different mindset. When you look back, you realize your naivety and probably stupidity.
Mhm.
Um, but we just kind of learnt on the job, man. We just
Yeah.
kept going. I mean, I remember when we had 3 employees, and so
Yeah.
I remember paying people. I remember sitting down and actually paying people's pay at the end of the month, and I did that for quite a long time because we didn't have
Yeah.
really any infrastructure support. I remember sitting in reception helping out because it's a very small practice. Um, and what we didn't realize is we were being educated. Life was educating us about how to run
Yes.
a GB practice. We did everything, man. And it sounds like I'm being romantic, but everything from like cleaning to doing the payroll to looking at HR, everything we learned from the ground up, which stood us in good stead, really. But
Yeah.
we didn't know it. We definitely didn't know it.
No. And you mentioned also in those first couple of practices quality improvement and also digitizing the practices. So how did you know what how did you know what quality improvement to implement, and what kind of digitizing are you talking about at that point?
So, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, many practices at the time had already, general practice has always been really innovative, always, and has been the most innovative part of the NHS. And so,
Mm.
our training practice that we trained at, so training practices that have trainee doctors tend to be a bit more, have a higher quality standard, I would say, potentially than a practice that doesn't, because previously you'd have visits externally to quality assure what you're doing. So we'd got in and we'd always been used to using a computer, but when we got there, this particular GP who unfortunately wasn't able to run the practice anymore had still been using paper.
Yeah.
We were just hamstrung. So it was just about how do you digitize the notes? Once you digitize them, how do you get disease registers up and running? Because QoF had just come in that year. It was the first year of QoF. Beg pardon, second year of QoF when we took over in April. So QoF had kind of come in as understanding how to get disease registers. But we found all sorts of stuff, man. We found, these were the old days, man. So, we found drugs that probably shouldn't have been lying around the
Mm.
practice. Um, all sorts of stuff in drawers that probably shouldn't be there. Things have changed massively. Um, but we had a general sense of what we wanted to do, and really in our minds at the time, we were just trying to get it up to a basic standard. I mean, I would say these were substandard practices because they were just out of date. They just weren't fit for that time. But that culture of innovation, I think, really kind of stayed with us all the way throughout. But how do you keep improving? How do you keep getting better?
Yeah.
Um, and trying new things. We were quite lucky in a way because when you don't have baggage from other, maybe a senior partner who's been around for a long time, you can do what you want to some extent.
Yeah.
And we tried and failed lots of times at stuff. But it wasn't a problem because our culture was, don't worry about it, try again.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how we did it.
And you talked about doing payroll, doing the cleaning, doing everything, sitting on reception, etc. So obviously you've got to do the clinical work as well and the doctoring.
Yeah,
So um, were you just there all hours? I take it it was not
yeah,
much
yeah.
not much family time or anything else.
It was, and the issue for us was that when we first, there were four of us, we really weren't earning enough to sustain us because our list size was tiny between the four of us, and we were all at that phase where we'd all just kind of got married a few years ago, maybe had one child, had all the same issues everyone else has now, the mortgages to pay, and
Mm.
part of it was like we need to like do something to make ourselves just we were well below, and we'd have our friends tell us, "Ah, you're wasting your time." I remember one of my friends said to me, "I'm doing a locum this weekend in Ipswich." I remember the conversation. He said, I've got a locum this week in Ipswich. It's a long bank holiday weekend. I'm getting £100 an hour. This is
Yeah.
2006, a long time ago, a lot of money. Getting
Yeah.
£100 an hour. I'm doing all these hours. You're wasting your time. And we were earning very, very little by comparison. But I think at that point we kind of realized that this is something. There's something to this that we can
Yeah.
do. But it was all by accident. I don't want to rewrite history and say we
Yeah.
were clever. We'd seen it. We definitely hadn't seen it. It was just,
Yeah.
just right place at the right
It
time.
was, yeah, too early for a vision, and you were just kind of following the passion by the sounds of it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so initially, the whole idea came about just because you guys wanted to work together. That was kind of the crux of it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and there wasn't a way to do that in terms of a traditional partnership. Because I was going to ask, why did you choose to go down this path rather than a traditional partnership? But is that just because you couldn't all six of you have a job in one partnership? There wasn't six vacancies in one place.
There was, that's absolutely correct. I mean, what happened is that there used to be a practice in Lambeth where we're really well established. Lambeth is one of our kind of bases where we have a good list size. But there's a particular practice in Lambeth that was our ideal because this practice at the time had 20,000 patients, and it was pretty much unheard of, certainly in and around London, to have such a large list size. There weren't many practices. Most practices were like 5,000, 6,000 list size. And so they were always our ideal, this particular practice, that, those guys were very innovative. They had their IT systems joined with the local trust. They had massive teaching kind of hubs as well. So, but we quickly realized that the general practice just wasn't at that time at any kind of scale. Most practices were tiny.
Yeah.
We call them kind of mom and pop size business. 5, 6,000 patients, 8,000 patients. A big practice at that time would have been like 10, 12,000. It's very different now because we had so many practices close. But it was just to work together. But I think we realized quite quickly that that just wasn't going to happen because we didn't get
Mm.
any positive responses.
So you've acquired, as part of AT Medic's 46 surgeries since those humble beginnings. Obviously, you cover 66 sites with your merger with Operose, but presumably you obviously went through 46, acquiring 46 surgeries. So what situations have those practices been in when you've acquired them? What kind of state have they been in?
Okay, I mean, they've been variable. That's the first thing to say. By and large, look, practices that come up for tender tend to come out because something's gone wrong in the practice, usually. Um, so either there's been an issue with CQC more recently, or there's been a partnership problem, or there was like a last man standing scenario, and then that person retires and goes. So mostly the practices we picked up were in very deprived areas, where typically people didn't want to work. So if you look at where our practices are, we've got practices in New Addington, which is one of the most deprived areas in Europe, I would say. If you look at Central Peckham, which I know is being gentrified, but Central Peckham still has much worse health outcomes. East London has terrible outcomes when you compare that to the national average. So they were all, by and large, in areas that were very diverse. Um, and so we just found that generally the care, as measured by some targets, wasn't very good. The culture in the practice was generally not very good. Um, Practice often stagnated because, maybe a very dynamic partner left, and the people that were left didn't really know what they were doing or
Hmm.
struggled, and so gave the contract back. So broadly speaking, we found practices that weren't very well run, and so really needed a lot of input on a lot of different fronts.
Hmm.
Um, we were lucky when we were much smaller. So for a long time, people think this is, whether they believe it or not, but we were doing a lot of clinical sessions. So for a very long period of time, we were all consulting like 8 sessions a week, which sounds crazy now, and doing
Hmm.
everything else at the
And
same
doing
time.
everything else.
So yeah, so we kind of learned, the clinical turnaround, we were deeply involved in ourselves. We knew what was going on because we were consulting all the time. Obviously, the law of diminishing returns, you can't keep doing that as you get bigger and bigger. Um, but then we would split our sessions between two sites until it got to the point where it's just unfeasible. Um, but really, culture, training. Um, One of the things that we did always find, though, is that in each practice, you would always find a gem of a staff member,
Hmm.
either an admin person or a nurse or someone who really believed in the process, really wanted to stay. Um, and in fact, one of the features, I guess, of our organization has been how we've had staff come through the ranks, um, really from juniors. So, I mean, you call it talent spotting.
Hmm.
But so these practices really need a lot of input, but really culture and staff is what make, we are, primary care is a service kind of sector. We are there to provide a service to our patients. So with all the best will in the world, if you don't have good staff, ultimately the care you deliver is going to be poor. Um, I guess the other thing to say is that we were always very, very focused, and I'm honestly not being holier than thou about this, but we were very focused on quality outcomes, very,
Mm.
very, very focused. Um, Mainly because some of these practices had never had very good achievements, so
Mm.
we wanted to make it better. Um, and second was we, unfortunately, when we started doing this, there was a lot of suspicion from our GP colleagues about who these guys were, why were they doing APMS, what do they want to do, um, and so we always kind of felt like we had a bit of a target on our back. We wanted to make sure that we were better than everyone else. So there's a huge competitive kind of streak in all of us that we wanted to be
Mm.
the best in terms of our QoF scores, our outcomes, our smears, our IMS,
Mhm.
and having systems and processes to do that. And naturally, that led to good patient outcomes. And then people started to recognize that actually the quality is very, very good in these sites.
Mm.
Um,
And
and
you've
that's
clearly
kind of
got a blueprint every time you take on a new practice, which is in special measures, or it's poorly staffed, or they're still using paper, or whatever it would be, poor QoF scores. So, ha, what's kind of the first things you do when you go into a practice to look at how bad it is, and what do you change?
I mean, look, it's a lot easier now, first of
Mm.
all, because
Yeah.
we've got, a much bigger team, and there are a lot more people with that knowledge. Yeah. But in general terms, look, the first thing tends to be the obvious stuff. Is there anything absolutely immediately that needs sorting out? Yeah. So is there
Mm.
anything safeguarding perspective? Are there, big, big problems with anything like clinical safety that cannot wait, needs to be done really on day one, day two, day three in the first week? Generally, after that, it's just understanding the culture within the practice that exists. So it's changing the culture of the staff that are there. That
Mm.
either means we work with the staff that are there, or it just naturally happens when you have new people coming in. Some staff naturally will leave. Unfortunately, sometimes you lose some good staff that way because they don't want to hang around to make a new relationship. It's not anything you've done, but the culture in the practice and the staffing for us, and then the training that goes into it is absolutely critical. And we spend a lot of time doing that, a lot of internal resource. And I think one of the things we realized early on is that in general practice, we wanted to really upskill staff to do the most they could do, really enjoyable for them because now they're
Mm.
working and their job is more interesting than maybe just, answering the phone, for example. Um, but really for HCAs to do something extra. And each time we've done that bit of innovation, we've got into trouble, and maybe we pick that up later on. Um, but but that but that kind of culture, I cannot stress the importance of that. The culture and the practice. Once you change that and you change the customer service, if you like, our patient experience changes, that's when you're fine. Because once the patients become friends with you and your vision and the patient's vision is the same, it's
Mm.
much easier. Um, and we learned that really through trial and error. In the beginning, we'd think we were doing something very good for patients, and patients just wouldn't be happy, wouldn't be happy, wouldn't be happy. It was only when we learned that actually you've got to take patients with you on the journey because they don't always understand why you might be doing something or why that might be
Mm.
better for them.
Yeah.
They just want their medication. Why are they coming in for a review? They haven't had a review for a long time. They just want their medication because they've always had their medication, their Zopiclone or whatever it was. So changing the culture within the practice and with our patient group, um, once we got those two things right, that's been the most successful practice that we've had. And
Yeah.
where we've got that wrong, and we have got it wrong for sure, things take much longer to resolve.
Mm. And you mentioned there about getting in trouble with innovation. So my next question was going to be about what the biggest challenges have been in growing AT medics.
I mean, I'll tell you something interesting. So, I mean, just on that one, because it came to my mind. I mean, this was, I mean, I'll say it. So this was in, or was it? It's an area in London, really, where probably about more than 10 years ago, so maybe 12 or 13 years ago,
Mm.
we had our HCAs. We trained up our healthcare assistants, who were really quite experienced at that time,
Mm.
uh, to do diabetic foot checks. which now is like normal. It's just normalized. That's what happens in practice. And we stopped or we said, in addition to our nurses, our HCAs can do diabetic foot checks and they can do some extra stuff that some of our nurses used to do. And, the chief nurse in this particular PCT reported us to NHS England for unsafe practice. So
Right.
we then had to justify how and why we were making our HCAs do some activities that just wasn't normalized at the time to do. And we kind of explained that, look, we've got this training program, it's what we do, these are the types of things they're doing, they're under supervision and so on. It's now normalized. No one would bat an eyelid for an HCA. In fact, it's encouraged that they do that type of stuff.
Mm.
But we found that, whenever you want to innovate and do something new,
Mm.
it always is a problem for some people.
Mm.
And so for a lot of the time, as long as we weren't breaking any rules, we're within the normal frameworks that you'd expect to see, um, we just kept innovating and trying
Mm.
and improving. And eventually, people have caught up. I mean, I would say we were very early on in using clinical pharmacists. In fact, we're probably outside of like Boots and Lloyd's and that kind of normal pharmacy, we're probably the largest employer of pharmacists, I think, in the country now,
Mm.
um, in primary care. And we went early. We realized there wasn't really a training program for them. We have kind of we developed a whole two organizations, which maybe we'll talk about later. But teaching and learning has been a real feature of our
Mm.
organization from the
Yeah.
beginning. So over half the practice, I think, are training practices. We train ST2 doctors, ST1, 2, and 3. We train foundation doctors. We train nurses. We have PA students. So the culture of teaching and learning has been really, really important.
Mm.
The most difficult challenge is, I mean, it's a funny one. Staffing has always been an issue in general, as far back as I can remember.
Yeah.
People have always talked about shortages of GPs, and that's always been an issue. It's much more of an issue now, um, maybe than it was 10 years ago, but staffing has always been a problem, finding good quality staff.
Mm.
Um,
Is that any
and
staff, or is that just clinicians?
I mean, so in the beginning, so practice nurses, as far as back as I can remember, have always been difficult to find trained up. So you'd often have to find someone who's good and train them up, but that's always been an issue. It's probably a bit easier now because I think, you know, maybe post-COVID, a lot of nurses are maybe leaving hospital nursing to come into the community.
Yeah.
Um, but that was always an issue. I remember the district nursing colleagues would always tell me that they just had shift. They just, they found it hard to find. GPs always been scarce supply. Even when we qualified, there was always a shortage of GPs. There were not enough GPs to go around. Um, when we first started employing pharmacists, there were plenty of them. There were loads of pharmacists when we first
Yeah.
started recruiting, but now
Yeah.
there's a
When was
shortage
that?
even.
When did you first start recruiting
Uh,
pharmacists?
I'd say probably, I think it was like 6 years ago, probably now.
Yeah.
I mean, we when we started getting pharmacists, there weren't many around in primary care at all, and
Yeah.
ARS money was hadn't, no one had even thought of
No,
it. It was
that's
much
probably
later, that
two to
way
three
later.
years ahead of ARRS funding, and yeah.
Yeah,
Whereas obviously you probably know these days that as the ARRS pot grows, there's going to be less pharmacists to take from community, from Boots and so on, because you've already taken them, and the pot gets bigger and bigger, and you can recruit more and more pharmacists, but the amount of pharmacists available is significantly reduced. Yeah.
and but the other thing I suppose is that when we started getting pharmacists in, we kind of brought them in as an adjunct to our other clinical teams. And I'll tell you a story about the pharmacists. It might be an interesting 30-second story. So one of the other things we haven't talked about is, as well as AT Medics, which was obviously our primary care service that we were running GP contracts. Around 2017, we realized that we really need to be in the tech business
Yeah.
because we needed our own tech. We were doing quite a lot of analytics using Excel spreadsheets. It just wasn't working. Once you
Mhm.
get beyond really 6, 7 practices, you can't get that level of insight. But as I said to you, teaching and learning had always been really integral to our organization, really from the very, very start. So we set up something called AT Learning, which was really an internal an organization within our organization which really took care of teaching and learning. So it
Mhm.
dealt with all the medical schools, with all the GP schools. Um, We developed our own teaching systems, assessment systems. And so what happened with the analytics is we developed our analytics tool. And when it first started up and running, we started finding all this stuff that we didn't know we hadn't been doing. So undiagnosed health,
Mm.
unmonitored medicines. And so, there's one thing not to know, but there's one thing, and the other is to know and not do anything about it. So
Mm.
it creates like a moral issue and an ethical issue. So
Yeah.
it was at that time that we decided to get pharmacists in. So the original reason why we got pharmacists was to fix all of these prescribing issues that we suddenly uncovered because we had our technology company, which has developed an analytics platform. We
Mm.
suddenly started looking at all this massive data that we'd never really seen in that kind
Mm.
of format. And so that's where pharmacists kind of came from to start with. And then obviously their role, once we had pharmacists in, I remember interviewing our first two, and I was kind of involved in recruiting our first two pharmacists, um, and just quickly realizing how good these guys were, and
Yeah.
them not realizing how good they were. They didn't realize their own potential because they came from the community.
Yeah.
And I think, getting into really deep clinical care, like you do in general practice, I mean, those guys are amazing. I mean, one is our kind of lead pharmacist for the South region, so she's still with
Mm.
us. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask about AT Tech, so now's probably a good time. So when you were talking about uncovering, I don't know, additional information and that type of thing, so what does that mean exactly? What has AT Tech done? Yeah. What are kind of the biggest achievements of that side of the business?
Yeah, so look, we talked earlier a bit about quality and about how you measure quality, certainly for the measurable aspects. Yeah. So, the thing about general practice is you can't measure every single thing, but there are many
Mm.
things that you can measure. And one of the things that were, if you like, part of our blueprint was to really develop our own dashboard. It was a manual dashboard.
Mm.
We started measuring really all the things that we could measure and record, and it was one person's job to kind of populate that. You can kind of do that if you got two, three. You can maybe even do it if you got four, but much
Mm.
beyond that, five, six, it becomes difficult. So we kind of realized that we needed some kind of data collection, data analysis tool. That's really where it started. What we then did is did a project with, there was something called a KTP, called a Knowledge Transfer Program, which was like a
Mm.
grant-based program that we bid for with the University of Surrey. And Imran, one of my colleagues, initially had the idea for that. And so we got a data scientist in to start working with us to develop and understand. He'd never worked in primary care.
Mm.
So really started looking at internal processes, dashboards, what we can collect. And that's really, so it started as a research project, which when it finished, actually won a prize for the best project in that particular cohort.
Right.
And we've now got like a fully functioning uh, data science. We've got four or five of them now
Wow.
working internally. And really, we've got our own data warehouse. We measure, we can, at the click of a button, look across all our sites now, nationally and in London, and look at over like 200 indicators of how we're performing. And then we have teams that go in and help to fix, and practices look at it. And it's that culture of data-driven care, and I think that's something that the NHS is starting to do, but maybe
Yeah.
historically could have done better.
Yeah.
Much more decision based on data rather than what I think, because I've got grey hair or no hair. Let's look at what the data tells us.
Yeah. Okay. So all this data was things that no one had ever done before, then presumably it wasn't being done in any of the surgeries, and the NHS wasn't doing it themselves. It was
I
innovative.
I think people were looking at data. I don't recall at that time, certainly when we started doing it, a really fully functioning primary care analytics tool um, that was really specific and designed by GPs to really give us what we wanted. And then testing it in real life primary care, we were able to do that because it was us, we were doing all of it. And then we had the last bit, which is the quality improvement based on it. So it was the three cycles, and putting that together over really a wide variety of things. And maybe if I give you one quick example. So we realized a few years ago that actually our diabetic outcomes were not great. Yeah. So we look at in diabetes, really, there are two big outcomes. One is that all patients should have like these 8 things done to them every year, which is like a foot check, a blood pressure,
Mm.
cholesterol, and so on. And then the second is that all of the three targets, which is their cholesterol, their sugar control, and blood pressure, should all be controlled simultaneously at a point in time.
Hmm.
When we looked at our outcomes were worse than London outcomes, which were worse than national outcomes. That was a starting point.
Yeah.
We then basically used our analytics tool, quality improve the learning. We upskilled everyone in diabetes. At the end of that particular year, we had so our size was the size of a CCG at that point. Yes, we had like
Yeah.
300,000 patients, which is like the size of a medium to large CCG.
Yeah.
If you then compared us to other CCGs, we had the best outcomes in the whole country for diabetes. There's evidence that says if you have all your 8 care processes, you live longer because you pick up complications.
Mm.
Um, we had the highest 8 care processes, over 90%. Our
Yeah.
triple target went up by 6-7%, and we continue. That's just become business as usual now. So
Yeah.
practices know to look at analytics. They know what they're looking at. They have a learning platform that allows them to put staff through a training program. We
Yeah.
record all our talks that we give. So in terms of quality improvement, it's just gone to the next level for many, many indicators.
Yeah. And when we talk about practices looking at these specific bits of data, we're not just talking about AT medics practices, presumably, are we? Are we talking
So
about,
I mean, I was talking
because
about
I know there's,
AT
yeah,
Yeah.
is there all, because I understand there's also software, different software then perhaps that you've developed that other practices use. I'm thinking EasyDoc and,
So just on analytics, so the analytics called Easy Analytics, that's been used by a CCG, a federation, and some smaller PCNs are using the analytics tool in the same way we use it.
yeah.
They're looking at data, looking at bits they can improve. So, the PCN has created tons of targets now that the Impact Investment Fund has got tons and tons of targets that you really need to monitor, and
Mm.
more money is being funneled through PCN. So I think that's probably here to stay. So people have found that as a useful tool to measure. You don't need lots of people bean counting. You just click a button, you see the
Right.
data, and so we found that to be useful. But externally, there's a council now using it to monitor the bits at the
Right.
council.
Yeah.
So the use for it is definitely wider than just general practice.
Yeah. And this will stop people, it'll be preventative for diabetes then. It'll have real impact on people's lives.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, if you can improve diabetes, one of the biggest challenges we've got now are long-term conditions, multiple long-term
Yeah.
conditions, and particularly diabetes. In London, especially, we have really diverse communities. If I look at East London, for example, we have the highest prevalence of diabetes, even within that borough, and in that borough, it's very, very high,
Mm.
because we've got lots of Bengali patients, for example.
Mm.
So improving outcomes, we know, will help the NHS because you need less dialysis, less amputation, blah blah blah. So
Mm.
that's just one disease process, but long-term condition. But doing that across a swathe will really help. So preventative care is a big part of the NHS. So improving flu jabs.
Mhm.
We've done very well with our flu jabs. If you look at our organizational outcomes for flu jabs, are very, very good. Again, same process. Data. So the blueprint for that now is very clear. Start with the data, internal training and program, iterating the
Mhm.
cycle. Um, but local for that particular population. But that cycle seems to work very well, very
Yeah.
well.
Oh, fantastic. It's great that you've developed something that no one else had thought of developing, and it's had a real impact on the health of people. Now, just before I speak to you about the merger with Operose Health, I just wanted to ask that up until the point of that merger, so up until you're at 46 sites with 18 medics, have there been any other specific events that you really struggled with in terms of growth, or just being part of something that became so big?
I mean, look, the as an organization gets bigger, there are lots of different thresholds you go through where you have to change the way you work. So the way you might run 5 or 6 practices is different to how you might run 10, how you might run 15. And when I look back on our history, we were very careful in how we were bidding. So we didn't just bid for anything that came out. There was
Mm.
a period where we got to, I think, 6 or 7, and we stayed like that for a very long time. We didn't bid for
Mm.
anything else because we went to consolidate that, and we hadn't really ever managed at that level. So the systems and processes that we needed to run those number of sites had to be something new that we had to innovate to what we were doing. Um, and so we were careful about bidding. And then latterly, once we realized our systems were good and they could take, it's like building the foundation and you can put some more stories on top. Then
Mhm.
we became a bit more relaxed about bidding for slightly bigger numbers, but we were always very careful. Um, Losing bids was even more depressing than writing them. So
Yeah, all
we
that
were
time.
lucky.
Yeah,
We were lucky we didn't lose many bids in the end. We
yeah.
had a very good outcome, but losing them was always tough. And sometimes we felt unjustly. We always had a bit of a kind of feeling of being hard done by because we always thought we produced very good bids. Um, I think staffing challenges are always difficult. Um,
Yeah.
Look, the biggest thing in general practice that I would say, and history kind of bears this out to be true. If you look at other larger organizations that
Mm.
have tried to come into general practice, um, the reason why they've struggled is because general practice is a very, very, very detailed business, very detailed system that you have to manage. Um, from clinical safety. So, for example, if I was managing a physio service, I mean, there's only so many risks I'm taking. Anything can come through the door in general practice on any time of day, any day of the
Mhm.
week, and you have to have the system and process to manage that, and the governance framework to manage that.
Mhm.
And so it's very, very challenging. Um, you have to be the leadership has to be very close on the ground.
Mm.
And if you go to all of our sites and talk to the staff, we are integrally involved in those sites. Um, and we're there, we're not sitting somewhere remotely giving orders out. We are there all the time.
Yeah.
And so that helped us, but the biggest challenges are really human challenges. It's staff, and people have stresses and strains in their life, understanding why people might not be performing how you want them to perform.
Mm.
um, Sometimes losing a very good member of staff,
Yeah.
who is really key. Again, we were quite lucky that we've got lots of senior staff that have been with us for a very long time, and many of these people started. Um, I mean, if I think three of our regional managers started off as receptionists, um,
Mm.
and
Right.
have gone all the way through. And I'd probably argue are probably some of our best managers that I've worked with across the NHS. They're
Yeah.
outstanding, and so kind of spotting those guys and getting them up. But like you said, I mean, the way we met was really by chance call, right?
Yeah.
And it was, as you get bigger, obviously your staff, all your challenges go up.
Yeah.
Um, and also the other thing I'd say is that, working in London. So I'll give you a good example. So we've never had a problem in a really big way in staffing Kings Road. We've got a surgery in Kings Road. We've had that for a very long time
Mm.
because the nice part of London is
Mm.
quite affluent. Who doesn't want to work like in Chelsea? But
Yeah.
it's not the same as another part of London that might be quite deprived, might have a bit of crime, people might not speak English, and
Mm.
we've got a lot of sites in those neighborhoods. Um, so you have to go the extra mile to recruit,
Yeah.
retain staff. Once staff are in, we find they love it because we love it. Um,
Yeah.
but I think that's been the biggest one, really.
Yeah. So in February 2021, you merged with Operose Health.
Mm.
Um, why did you choose to do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, I suppose broadly speaking, man, as you get bigger, um, you we were caring at the point of the merger. I think we were caring for about one in somebody will check it out, but like one in 18 Londoners. Yeah, one in every 18 Londoner was registered at one of our sites,
Yeah.
and we'd often like joke about not traveling in the same car because we couldn't lose like two 80 minutes directors if we died at the same time. What that might mean. So
Right.
we
Yeah.
used to laugh about there's a weight of responsibility
Yeah.
for providing care at that scale. Um, the second thing for us was the things that we enjoyed, which really was the clinical aspects of it. Um,
Mm.
we started to really be pulled away from that because it becomes such a substantial operation. And what we wanted really was for someone to help us and take away some of the boredom which sits with HR and finance and some of those corporate functions. And so we could really concentrate as GPs on the things that we enjoyed, which was working with the teams, teaching education, um, some stuff around governance and innovation.
Mm.
And we felt that that was becoming more and more challenging in terms of time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we felt that with a national footprint, we'd have more resilience. Nick Harding, who is our CMO, very, very highly respected professor, GP, been in the NHS his whole life. Um, when we started talking to Operose, really we talked to him and Sam Jones. And Sam again had been the chief CEO of an NHS trust. She'd worked for NHS England. So having talked to them, really, it just became. Sometimes you meet people and you hit it off, really, and
Mm.
the discussions were really around how the organizations would look once we came together, what
Hmm.
our role might look like, and it just really was appealing to us at that stage to have a role where we could go back to doing what we used to do when we had a much smaller number. Um, you can't really go backwards, so we had to think, okay, how can we do that? And I think definitely we've been vindicated on that front. So, having merged with Operose, I would say our governance systems are better than they were. I think they were good, but I think they're better.
Hmm.
Um, I think having more senior clinicians, almost, because what I didn't mention is that the six of us met at medical school. We've been together
Mm.
since we were 18. Um, and I won't say we're insular, but you become very close, even closer
Yeah.
than maybe sometimes you might do with your immediate family. So it was nice to get someone with a fresh perspective on things.
Yeah.
Um, and I suppose the last one really was what we wanted to do and what we still want to do is innovate more. So, for example, one of the things we always wanted to do was to take on more responsibility for our patients.
Mm.
So when we developed our digital consultation tool, when we first started doing it, we used to leave our consults open 24 hours a day, and we would deal with them on the weekends just out of pocket. We would just employ people to deal with it. But if we could take the budget for out of hours and maybe start to do some of that stuff, then you really get into something very interesting. Um, so really, we didn't feel that we had the reach in,
Yeah.
um, if I'm honest. So we kind of knew our skill set. Um, And maybe on reflection, if I'm being, brutally honest, maybe that kind of integration with higher levels of within the NHS hierarchy, we're probably lacking in that, either because we didn't know how to do it, or maybe we just didn't have the skill set to do it. You can't do everything. So I think that coming together with Operos now, if you look at our spread as a very mature organization, very resilient, um, excellent systems and processes, um, really excellent systems and processes around governance, patient safety, patient care. I think all of those things are stronger. So coming together has just made everything a lot better. I think,
Mm.
you know, I also think we were a great organization, um, just standalone, but
Yeah.
you can always get better.
And being part of Operos now, I know it brings so much more scrutiny and challenge. You've had national attention in the press, on TV, on social media, of course. I mean, I think the media's kind of auto standpoint is always negative towards a bigger organisation without actually seeing the humans involved. But is some of that negativity, is it just political, or is there a wider lack of understanding of how primary care actually works in the media, or is any of the scrutiny justified, do you think?
Look, I think when you get to a certain size, I think it's normal to attract attention.
Hmm.
I think when you attract attention, some of that attention is going to be good and some is going to be bad. Um, and you'll always have, particularly now, I think with social media, you find with any issue, people are very polarized on the
Yeah.
view. Um, and actually, most topics in life are much more nuanced. They're not black and white. So um, there are clearly some people that have just taken a view that irrespective of what you say and do, they will
Hmm.
dislike you. They will dislike what you do. They will say negative things about you.
Yeah.
Um, I'd like to think other people are more fair-minded, and we certainly have had people that have said, "I think that's unfair. I know what you guys do. I know you guys on a personal level. I know how it's gone." So I think scrutiny is fine. I don't think we're that fast. People can scrutinize and challenge, and we're happy to respond to that challenge as long as done in a fair way, in a balanced way. Um, what doesn't help is silly kind of like headlines um,
Hmm.
about being taken over or
Yeah.
privatization, because those people that are saying it know full well what they're saying is just rubbish. I mean, there's no
Yeah.
appetite. We've never ever been involved in any kind of in that process. We've always been GPs. We see ourselves within the NHS family. We're all GPs like everybody else. And
Yeah.
so I think that those types of headlines aren't helpful. Some of the stuff that comes out is just factually incorrect. Three times in my life, I've known about a story on the inside that has gained national attention. I won't go into what the other two are. And the last one obviously was with Operose. And
Yeah.
each of the three times, when you read the reporting in whatever it is, you realize how detached it is from what's happening in real life.
Mm.
And so it makes me wonder how much stuff I read on a daily basis that probably is detached from the real
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Um, but you know that kind of scrutiny, I guess we have to expect. I think it will be ongoing. Um,
Yeah.
People are always suspicious,
Yeah. It's not just going to
and
stop.
it's not
I
going to stop.
I always find the privatization one really weird because the thing is, I mean, journalists must know how primary care is set up. I know the general public doesn't know that each individual practice is often a partnership and they're run by that partner, and those partners take drawings, and therefore it's run as a business. And Operose Health AT Medics, it's no different. It's an NHS contract providing an NHS service to NHS patients, and you pay NHS pensions even. You know, it's completely within, like you say, the NHS family. And I know the general public doesn't know that, so they just go, "Oh, privatization, you know, it's bad, and it's happening under our noses." Well, it's always been like that, or at least I don't know. Was it 1947, or it's certainly been like that way beyond my
It's always been
lifetime
like that.
anyway. I think it has always been like that. But the journalists must know, and
Yeah,
that's what's
I mean,
annoying.
look, the first thing is that all GP contracts, and particularly APMS contracts, are extremely stringent. So this idea that a company or a couple of people come in, set up a limited company, come in and take over and slash and burn is
Yeah,
just not possible. You know, general practice is probably one of the most regulated sectors of any sector, right?
yeah,
CQC can come down at the drop of a hat. They can come down
yeah,
tomorrow unannounced.
yeah. If there's a problem, you know, you answer to the CQC, not to
CQC, CCG,
journalists.
NHS England. Yeah, there are so
Yeah,
many, or I mean, ICSs as they are now. But I mean, so the first thing is that in terms of the way we're set up, you have to provide the service you're contracted to provide. If you don't provide that service, there are very clear levers
yeah,
to someone saying to you that's not on. Um, and so in terms of some of the stuff is just, I mean, in terms of privatization, um, people saying it know what they're saying, and you know it's just factually incorrect. You know, no patient is
yeah,
ever charged. The NHS is free at the point of entry.
yeah.
I
I
mean, how
understand.
many people go to A&E department or urgent care centers that are run by other organizations? They wouldn't know the difference. You just walk
No.
in, you get your care. Um, and so some of the stuff is just it's just tiring really having to explain it again and
Yeah,
again. Um,
yeah.
because especially when GPs say it, they know it's nonsense. And it's just it's just rubbish.
I mean, the other small point is that APMS contracts are lower funded than PMS and GMS. So actually, it's good value for the taxpayer, if anything.
They, so look, the thing about APMS contracts is that they're not. So although the contracts are now more standard, so they never used to be standardized at all. That's the
Mm.
first thing. They used to be by CCG, by time. Now APMS contracts are more standardized, but the funding varies according to that particular. I mean, it's ICSs now. They kind of decide the level of funding they want to give to it, and so they make a decision on what services they want, what they're prepared to put into it, and so it varies. It varies contract by contract.
Yeah. And I think in general, obviously in primary care, operos and AT medics, you're driving the changes in primary care that the government has asked you to do and that many are calling for. So the use of GP-led multidisciplinary teams. We've mentioned pharmacists, of course, physician associates as well, which has had some negative press, which is quite bizarre because there's literally a government scheme to fund physician associates. But anyway, but also using technology, being digital first and data driven as well. So you're very much at the forefront. You know, that innovation that I guess the seeds were sown in 2004 with your first practice wanting to digitize and innovate. So is that an exciting or a scary place to be, that you're very much at the forefront and driving primary care forward?
Yeah, I mean, if I just pick up just a couple of those bits that you mentioned. So, one of the key changes, I think, you talk to anybody, and you know better than anyone else in terms of GP recruitment, is we know there's a GP staffing crisis up and down the country. It's going to get worse. Government agenda is to have through RRS, multidisciplinary teams. One of the accusations was that we employ a disproportionate, I mean, we employ 39 permanent PAs in our organization. We've only got 66 sites, so that's about, I don't know, it's just over around a half
Mm.
PA per site, which I don't think anyone will argue is too much.
Seems
Um,
below average, if anything.
it's a low number.
Yeah.
In terms of sites, in terms of pharmacists, it's the same. We've got probably more pharmacists, but it's probably averages out to maybe one pharmacist per site. It's probably a bit less. Um, so some of the numbers are just plain wrong. So it's just getting behind the headlines.
Yeah.
Look, if I just cut away from that into really what is really happening on the ground, what what I think is happening on the ground is certainly I can only talk for our own organization. So we've spent a very, very long time and used technology. So we've got our own intranet, for example, to upskill our staff that are either PAs or pharmacists or nurses or whichever stage you're at. We have got a training program which is online that we have created, is bespoke. We've designed it, we've delivered it. It's not an external organization. It's CPD accredited now, um,
Mm.
and you're able to do that online. All right. So if you join our organization, you have no excuse for not progressing yourself in your career and improving your knowledge. If I take PAs and pharmacists, we have a 2 weekly program of teaching. Um, it's done. It's live teaching that's done through Zoom or Teams or whatever. We do OSCEs for our own. This is all funded by ourselves, by the way. There's no external funding for any of this stuff. Um, So that upskilling that I talked about is now finessed, it's professional, it's measurable. We can check competencies, and we work within all the current frameworks that exist outside, right? Um, the second is because we own our own tech company,
Mm.
it's very empowering. You can design the tech to how you want it. So in terms of how patients interact with us, I mean, we've got 300,000 patients registered on our interactive on our Doctor IQ platform, which is our online consultation platform, which is
Right.
an app that allows you to order repeat scripts. You can consult with us. We're kind of, I think, probably a bit ahead of everyone else. So when we first started, we were like everybody else. So you had one practice having online consultations coming in, and then that online consultation was dealt with by that practice team. We kind of realized probably about, during COVID, when obviously we were lucky with the timing because everybody went digital. What we're doing now is moving into hubs, so delivering all our digital care for a particular region through a hub. So if I take the region I'm most involved in is Southwark. So Southwark, we've got like 55,000 patients. In Southwark, what we do now is rather than burden the practice team, we've created an admin team called a digital admin team that just deal with all the digital transactions that come in. So any digital contact, that's registrations, dealing with prescriptions, all that kind of stuff. And then we've got a centralized clinician team where you have a GP who is basically supervising a team of PAs and pharmacists, and they get direct supervision. So they're sitting in the same room side by side. So I was there yesterday, so I'm sitting side by side. People can ask questions. I'm picking up calls where there are issues. So that digital interaction with the practice now is a very positive interaction in the main, where people get through. It doesn't cause like a frenetic atmosphere at the practice. The practice can get on and just deal with what I would call quote unquote traditional, people either calling up or having a face-to-face appointment, turning up. And so I think this is the future. I think in future, this is how things will happen in terms of on the day, you will have hubs,
Hmm.
MDT hubs, supervised by GPs. So you'll have consultant GPs who will be supervising a team of MDTs. I just think we're there right now. And
Hmm.
those that can't see it, maybe it suits them not to see it, but those that understand workforce planning going forward will absolutely understand this is the way it will have to
Yeah.
be. So, you know,
So per region of London, you've got an admin team effectively and a clinical team which is headed up by a GP who then runs working as a consultant like you say. So that's per area of London. And um are they based at a certain practice then, or you kind of have like
So,
flagship practice per area? How does it work?
no, just I mean, to be honest, in London, as you know, we're constrained by space. That's a big problem.
Mm,
Real estate is some of the most expensive real estate in the world. So
yeah.
within our practice, where we've managed to eke out some space, cleared out a loft somewhere, move some boxes out of the way, we've created little hubs. Um, we've got some lovely sites as well. So we've got a lovely site in East London, which is like a brand new build, where we've managed to find some nice room. We've created a hub there, North Central London. So where we found space and really swept the buildings that we're in, we've got hubs. Um, I think uh, so that works well because it's regionalized. So the people working in those hubs don't exclusively just work there, they'll work within the practice so that there's no
Mhm,
disconnect. The GPs that supervise also work as normal GPs, they're not just doing that role. You have to have that kind of in and out of the hub so that you're not losing the connection with the practice staff so it doesn't feel too remote.
mhm,
Um, but on the day when you're just doing a normal shift, the digital, which lots of practice struggled when digital really took off, but then COVID kind of went and they were left with their normal demand, really struggled to deal with that combination. Um, we struggle like anybody else, but I think those systems make it better for us, make it better for our teams, make it better for our patients.
mhm.
Um, and we're still working out how to do it. So, we've got three different models of running our hubs. We're currently experimenting on what the best way to run them is. So we haven't
Mhm.
decided on exactly the right method. Um, when we do a wash up, we'll see which is the best way forward. We still argue about it all the time.
Yeah. Cool. And then my last question, you've stolen my thunder slightly, but I was going to ask you what the next 10 years of primary care looks like in the UK. So you've talked about the hubs already. Is there anything else to add?
So I think the use of technology. So I think as analytics becomes much more finessed, um, as analytics starts to look at unstructured data, because what happens right now is analytics kind of looks at what you have, and like I said to you, tells you what you're not doing
Mm,
based on what you may not have done. I think the next 10 years has to be much more about predictive analytics. How do we pick up patients before they start to get unwell? How do we start to monitor early warning systems in primary care? I know they're starting to develop that in hospital, in primary care, because as we start to work as part of complete systems, we all have an incentive to keep patients out of hospital. It doesn't make sense. We'll have capitated budgets across primary care, secondary care, community care.
mhm,
So I think predictive analytics is a really important part,
mhm,
and how we start to manage that for better patient outcomes. We talked a bit about multidisciplinary working in general. So I think that's a separate point. So it's accepting. I mean, I was talking to my wife and I was just saying that, as we get older, we have to accept there will just be less GPs. As when we start to get sick
mm,
in maybe, hopefully, long time, but when we start to get older, have multiple long-term conditions,
yeah,
who will manage those conditions? Because there just aren't enough GPs to go around. There just won't be enough. So the reality is that you will likely see maybe a specialist pharmacist or a specialist PA or
yeah,
something of that nature. Um, and then the third aspect, I guess, is about how we're going to work. And I think hub working for some things, not for everything, because I think the GP patient interaction is an important one and we have to maintain it as far as we can. We know continuity has much better outcomes for some patients who need it, want it, desire it. Um, so that's important that we hang on to that as much as we can. Um, whether that's possible or not is a question, and it will be a shame if we lose that completely. I
mm,
think we've lost some of that already because of part-time working, or
mm.
GPs working 3 days a week, and because general practice is so difficult that it's hard to work maybe
The
as people worked
portfolio.
30 years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah, where you had one GP from cradle to grave. I think that's more difficult now.
yeah. Okay. Interesting. So I did say that was my last question, but did just want to give you an opportunity to speak to any GPs or nurses or allied health professionals that might be considering their career options in either London for AT Medics or elsewhere in the country for Operose Health. Why should they join AT Medics or Operose?
Great question. I mean, look, I would say without not sounding too salesy. I mean, look, the first thing is that we have spent a long time trying to understand where are the pressures in general practice for GPs, yeah, and what can we control? So we really try to control admin because that has been a source of burnout for many, many GPs. So we
Mhm.
really try to control that through the use of allied health professionals. So, pharmacists are signing most prescriptions, signing a very small number. So, our GPs, and I'll be happy for anyone to ring up and ask them, probably do, on average, maybe 10 documents. They might do like, 10 bloods, a very small number of prescriptions because they are being done to a very high standard by people that are helping them. That would therefore mean they can provide a higher quality of care. Um, those systems, processes, caring for our staff, I think it just shows by the number of GPs that stay with us and have been with us for a very, very long time. And the GPs that have left us have tended to because they've moved geographically somewhere completely or moving abroad
Mhm.
or whatever. Um, but I think those GPs would enjoy that. I think working with an MDT team actually is far more enjoyable.
Mhm.
You get to see other people's strengths and weaknesses. Um, and I think people that want to progress, we don't have a traditional partnership where, you may have a partner who kind of does everything. Ours is so decentralized that people that want to get on have very clear career path from, being a GP to being a lead GP in a practice. We've now got regional medical directors in our practice
Mm.
that are very senior GPs that have been with us for a while, that whose role is much more management plus a bit of clinical. So I think that career path is clearer. Um,
Mhm.
I suppose a big elephant in the room that you asked me, I'm going to go back to the last question is, Sajid Javid had floated the idea that all GPs would become salaried to
Yeah.
ICS and we'd lose partnerships altogether. Um,
That was 2 health secretaries ago now.
that was too helpful. Yeah,
in,
it's
in
true. You're absolutely
January,
right. Yeah, we've got
8
to freeze
months
the
ago.
clock in now. So that idea has kind of come in and gone out, come in and gone out, and you just feel like there's a government kind of agenda towards that, and we'll see the
Coming
current
after
health secretary
partnerships. Yeah.
if they go for that. I think that'd be the other big change.
Yeah. Cool. That's great. Thank you very much for joining, Hasnain. Really interesting. I love the fact that you started AT Medics because you just wanted to work with your uni mates.
That's true.
um, Sounds like it's been an amazing journey so far. Obviously, a huge contribution to the NHS, not just running the practices, but also the innovation and the tech that you provide to the NHS. And it's been really interesting. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, James, for inviting me. Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers, man.